Hello and welcome back to the Debatable Discussions podcast. Today we've got a very exciting episode as me and Dejan will be delving into a bit of philosophy again, and in particular, morality.
Today we're going to be talking about utilitarianism and deontology as the sort of two big categories in which morality is split. And we will be having a sort of in-house debate on whether political decisions come from an absolutist or consequentialist view. So make sure to watch to the end. It should be, sparks should be flying, gesticulation, and everything else. So yeah, let's get into it.
Yes, so firstly, perhaps we'll look at utilitarianism. Now, what utilitarianism is, and is it good? So perhaps I'll explain utilitarianism. So for me, I've always found utilitarianism fairly easy to understand because of a short acronym I've learned at school, and that is GG4GN, greatest good for the greatest number. And that is what utilitarianism is at its core. What action causes the greatest amount of good or the greatest amount of utility, which is a sort of more formal way of saying good, for the greatest number of people. Therefore, it's looking at things such as maximizing happiness or maximizing pleasure. Now, there have been several different takes on utilitarianism, one could say. We have Jeremy Bentham, who articulated the theory, and he came up with act utilitarianism, which is obviously based on working out the amount of pleasure produced by a single act, and you choose that one act. Then Mill came after Bentham, and Mill was very clever. Mill answered the many criticisms of Bentham's act utilitarianism by formulating rule utilitarianism, which differs from Bentham's act in that it effectively there's a rule book, there's a system of rules, and that's how one can decide what their action is, which promotes the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. Since there have been a few philosophers like Karl Popper, Peter Singer, I think Henry Sedgwick as well, and they've come up with sort of formulations, developments of utilitarianism. These have things like Singer's interest utilitarianism, so greatest number of interests fulfilled. That's slightly different because Singer believes that animals have interests, rather controversially. So that one's controversial. But then there have been other ones, such as Popper's negative utilitarianism, so causing the least amount of harm. But yes, Dejan, what do you think about utilitarianism? Are you a foe of it, or are you quite friendly?
Well, I think I'm a bit skeptic when it comes to utilitarianism for a couple of reasons, but mainly due to the fact that I don't associate happiness with necessarily good.
Yeah.
I think some actions produce a lot of happiness for a lot of people, but they're not morally good. For example, I don't know, taking illegal substances would be one that comes to mind. For example, if 10 people would like to do that, that would provide them for happiness. However, I don't think from a sort of moral standpoint, you can equate that happiness to genuine. So I think that, this is a fairly harmless example, but there are examples which are a bit more out there when it comes to this. And for this reason, I think utilitarianism is a good idea, good intention behind it, but it's so tough, sort of reinforced. I think negative utilitarianism I can get behind a bit more because it looks at the sort of flip side of the argument.
Yeah.
And causing less suffering, I think that's an objectively good thing. Whilst causing more happiness, I don't think it is.
No, yeah, I agree with you there. I think even with less suffering, it's also subjective utilitarianism, because some may say that action causes less suffering, but others may disagree. But I think it's even more amplified when you look at pleasure. I mean, the famous ones is the sadistic guard argument. People get pleasure out of murdering people, a group could say. Is that justified then? That's a big issue.
No.
Yeah. And another idea which you mentioned, which is very important, and I think people don't really think about it enough when they're considering utilitarianism, is do we want to just live in a world of just pure happiness? In the sense that there was an American philosopher, Robert Nozick, he made the experience machine up. And he said, you've almost got to have normal actions that are neither really, really, that aren't the actions that promote happiness the most, but just
Yeah.
somewhere on that scale, because you almost need to know what true happiness is like. And he said, do we really want to live in a world just full of true happiness? Whereas, actually, as you mentioned that, I think a world of less suffering is objectively good, whereas the
Yeah.
most happiness, there's a bit of room there left with, yeah, but what does it mean? Yeah. And perhaps, Dejan, could you also now explain deontology?
Yeah. So
And
deontology is a sort of opposite view
yeah,
one can hold when it comes to sort of morality, and that is absolute. It's got some rules that are bent into the very essence of nature. There are a couple of people who subscribe to this. Thomas Aquinas is one, Kant most famously, and Kant comes with the categorical imperative. That is his sort of big thing, and he says that if you cannot do an action in all circumstances, then it's not a moral action. So, for example, lying, although in some circumstances it may be
useful, I guess.
preferred even, Kant says if you can't do it in all circumstances, then you can't apply that. And he uses the example, and a lot of people is like, okay, but what if, for example, in 1942, in 43, 44 in Europe, you're hiding Jewish people in your house, and the sort of Gestapo knocks on your door and says, do you have Jews in this house? And a lot of people say I would lie. But then the sort of deontological argument here is, what if the people in your sort of wherever they are, in the other side of the house, heard the knocks and jumped out the window,
Yeah,
right? And they've left the house, and you, instead of letting the Gestapo come in and search the house, you're saying, no, 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 don't have any Jewish people. And they go around the house and they find them.
oh yeah,
So it's, you can never know the outcome.
yeah.
And that's why Kant and the more rigid sided theontology is for the stringent rules, because they think you cannot predict the future. And I, I agree with that, to be honest.
Yeah, that's a really good point there, and that should be really, and it must be, but that should be one of the forefront criticisms of utilitarianism, because obviously deontology is act based, it's rule based, and it's concerned with duty, but utilitarianism is consequentialist. But the issue of any consequentialist ethic, as you just said there, is that we can't predict the future. We aren't sort of future predictors. How can we know this will cause the most amount of happiness in the case of utilitarianism if we don't know the future? It could be actually entirely different. So that is actually very interesting. I also like deontology in the sense that I think people try and act with duty in general in life. It's sort of in primary school, one of those values they try and sort of drill into you. They say, act with kindness. You have a duty to be kind. And I think that reflects it. It doesn't matter if the consequences are unkind. As long as you try and be kind and act with that duty, it's fine. Similarly, I think it's in the legal profession as well. Or judges, they've got a duty to show justice. And it's far easier being able to actively do that duty than to say, well, I think this will cause the most amount of justice, but who am I to say because I can't predict the future? So, yeah, I think that's a definite strength of deontology. Why else do you like it, Dejan?
I think it's again this sort of notion of the categorical imperative.
Yeah,
That Kant says for an action to be moral, one, you need to be able to apply in all circumstances, and two, you can't sort of have it damage anything else.
yeah,
So again, going back to the concept of lying, he says, well, lying is not a moral action because one, you can't apply it to all situations, but also, if you apply lying to all situations, trust wouldn't exist anymore.
okay.
So it's this thing that if you have an action to be moral, it doesn't need to negatively affect anything else. I think that's probably a good way to just set out the moral boundaries. And of course, they can't, deontology does, especially Kant, does live. Because an example is, again, for example, speeding to get to the hospital, right? A lot of people would say, oh, deontology says that is immoral and you can't do that. Yes, but no. And there are two actions happening. The action of speeding and the action of getting to hospital to save your life.
Yeah,
And deontologists with Aquinas and Kant and everyone would say saving one's life is always the sort of most important thing. We can break every other rule as long as the top action is in accordance to deontology, and that top
Uh,
action is saving your life. So, was speeding immoral? Yes. However, that gets trumped by the fact that you've got this more important action that you need to fulfill.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a sort of caveat of deontology, which I don't think I understood. I've understood in the past, and that duty. There's many forms to duty, as you said there. Sort of there's higher and lower duty. Sort of like natural moral law, for example. That's obviously got higher duties, like saving life. I think preserving a harmonious society. That's a higher duty almost than something far less important.
Yeah.
Nicely sort of moving on from what you just said there, I thought we could discuss absolutist versus relative morality. So maybe Dan, you explain absolute, then I'll explain relative. And that,
Yes.
for any listeners who don't know, this is the sort of loose framework to which these theories sort of hang.
Yes. Absolute morality is basically deontology, and that deontology and many other forms, but deontology definitely is an absolute form of morality, in that you can only sort of an action is either right or wrong, and that doesn't change depending on the circumstance or consequences of it. So killing is wrong, full stop. Killing is always wrong, doesn't matter. Um, you know, it doesn't allow for much sort of interpretation over this particular set of circumstances. But again, as I've covered before, deontology does have some leeway, and that can be sort of looked at and analysed.
Yeah, and then sort of conversely to that, you have relativism, and this is basically the idea that right or wrong changes depending on the situation. It's all relative to a certain situation, to certain circumstances. A common one's the argument of murder, and that says you can justify murder if it's in war, but you can't justify murder if it's sort of on the streets type thing in a harmonious place. And that's the main difference. It's all about, it's very situational ethics, relativism. You don't have these sorts of rules. So absolutists would obviously have rules that killing is bad. Doesn't matter whether it's a war, it's a bad thing to do. Whereas relativism is very situational. And I think that actually perhaps is a disadvantage of relativism in any sense and in any field, whether that's morality or sort of any other thing you encounter, it's harder to follow because you make the judgment. Absolutism's obviously made for you. So, like an absolutist
Yeah, pretty
ethic could
much.
be the Bible, whereas relativism's a more individualist ethic, which has got its advantages but also its disadvantages. So, Dejan, perhaps you can commence to saying which one do you think is better? Are you more of an absolutist or a relativist?
I'm definitely more of an absolutist. Because I don't think, again, relativism has got its own problems. Don't think it's necessarily sustainable for everyone to decide what's right and what's wrong. We get into a state of anarchy, but not sort of the anarchy that I'm thinking of. It's more the anarchy of sort of chaos and
Yeah.
unchecked, uh, actions. And yeah, I just can't see sort of be explained in a way that I can't find a loophole with, and then
Yeah.
I just can't subscribe to it. Yeah, you, John?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm perhaps differ from you in this area because I am perhaps a bit bigger of a relativist. And my main thing with relativism is there's sort of a geographic perspective, one could say, on the take. And that is that there is huge moral diversity. And so I think if you look at the world in the sense that if you look at the world, obviously morality is relativist across the world, sort of like you've got
Well, yeah,
Sharia law. That's very different to the one could say like the Christian Jewish law of this sort of European world. So yeah, I think I'm more of
but
a
I would
relativist.
argue.
I agree with you there are objective evils, but then I don't, and they're shared across the world. But then I think it's not absolute for the entire world in the sense that if you go to, I'm sure, tribal Papua New Guinea, there they may not think something that we think is bad is necessarily that bad. I'm not one to say, but I think there's an idea of tolerance across cultures and that moral diversity, which I find quite convincing about relativism. What do you have to say,
Yeah,
Dan?
I'd argue to that. That I do see the world um, with a universal set of values and moral ethics. I don't think necessarily the Jewish or the Christian or the whatever values are necessarily the right ones.
Yeah,
I think it's a mix and match. But I think if you look at some cultures, and you can obviously say cannibalism should not happen. I can't find someone who can make a compelling argument as to why you should eat another person.
yeah,
I don't also find anyone who can make a compelling argument as to why, stone women to death. I
yeah.
can't find anyone who can also make a compelling argument of sort of, what's happening now in the USA of stopping
Yeah.
federal funding to Harvard because they don't want to allow you to intervene in their maths. I can't find those things. And because of that, I do think that there is only one sort of set of absolute moral law,
But would you say that's a
which,
sort of moral superiority you think of Western values?
no,
Because
no,
no,
because I don't think the Western code is necessarily the right one.
but do you think it's superior then to, let's say,
No,
African sets of morals? Well, you just did say you
no,
thought, but would you not say, but with that argument, you think it's superior to, let's say, African morals, where if
no.
you go back to 18th century African society, you know, it's historically understood that just cannibalism occurred.
Yeah, but
Human,
if you go back to 18th century Western society, people still had slaves.
yeah, they did. But do you think that still exists in the world today? There is still cannibalism exists in the world today.
Yeah,
Human sacrifice still exists. You
I don't
said
think
you
that's a
can't find
question
an
of sort of,
you said you can't find an argument for that being morally right. So would you thus say that the Western morals are superior, is what I'm trying to say?
no, I wouldn't. I think cannibalism is an example of something some people got wrong, and that needs to change. But I think if you look at Western society, there's plenty of examples of what
Yeah,
people got wrong. And I don't know, let me just think of an example again. Trump, what's happening in the USA, what he's doing there, deporting everyone, people with US passports are now going to get deported, apparently. I don't any person who can make a compelling argument to that reason. I can't find anyone who can make a compelling argument for sort of burning witches at the stake, which was what European societies did in history, having slaves, etc., etc., etc.
but in
And
right. Oh no, no, no,
yep,
you carry on, you carry on.
yeah, and there are all these things that people across the world did that I think are horrible. And the question is more about trying to find what every part of the world got right and getting it into one sort of.
I think that's very difficult though, and this is why I do agree with the relativist view, is because I think religion is the biggest obstacle to sort of coming up with one global code. Because there are
Yeah,
places where religion obviously being seen as this beacon of morality, there are places where religions are morally opposed to one another. So I can't come up, I think, let's say, for example, many parts of Sharia law, especially, their treatment of the LGBTQ plus community, I think that's absolutely abhorrent. But I'm sure if I asked someone from that part of the world, they could make an argument saying that what happens is acceptable simply because of religious doctrine.
but I don't think you
Similarly,
can make that argument.
similarly, I think if we went to Africa, tribal African communities in the past, their religious beliefs, they would have said it's morally right because my God believes in it, my deity believes in it. And it similarly should be applied to the West because a lot of Western morality is based off religion. We shouldn't kill. I think you can defend killing from a non-secular perspective as well. I mean, from a secular perspective as well. But all our Western morals, I view them as they're fundamentally rooted in Christianity.
But
I think it's hard to have one absolute set of morals with so much religious diversity across the world.
I agree with that. I think it's hard, and for practical reasons, maybe impossible. But sort of theoretically,
Yeah,
I don't think anyone can make a convincing argument saying with all of them saying is it's right because I read it in the Bible, or it's right because I read it in the Quran, or it's right because it's in there. Because unless you can defend points from both a religious and a secular perspective, I find them very weak.
yeah, me too. Yeah,
And this is as a believer, so that I don't get attacked for just saying for the saying this. I think if you can't defend a point from non-religious perspective, it is probably a bit weak, because again, I find it incredibly difficult for anyone to make a moral argument from a non-secular perspective of, I don't know, stoning women, in comparison to someone making an argument about not killing, which is applied in all religions, right? So, for example, don't kill is a universal thing, and you can defend that from both a religious and a secular perspective. You can defend, not assaulting people, both, violently and sexually. You can defend that from both perspectives. You can defend
But can you?
lying.
Because there
Yeah,
are
you
cultures
can.
in which sexual assault, I'd imagine there are religions in which things like sexual assault, human sacrifice, especially non-formalized religions, by that I mean ones without an official sort of book doctrine, more like tribal religions, I'd
Yeah,
imagine
but you can defend that from a secular perspective.
you can defend it from a secular perspective, but you can't from a religious perspective.
But you can defend it from a religious perspective in some cases, right?
Yeah, in some cases, yeah, only in some cases.
Yeah, but the most important one is being able to defend it without
Yeah.
attaching any sort of bias to it, and being able to say, look, this is immoral because of, and you have a sort of sound argument that people can actually use, and not just say, well, it's it's moral because it's my religion, but there are other religions that maybe don't agree with you in that case, and then you need to defend it from a secular perspective. So yeah, again,
It's difficult, yeah. So, yeah.
I find it very hard that if people just say, oh, this is what my belief is. Well, why is your belief? Because it's my belief. I don't think that makes a lot of sort of
Sense. I know,
sense.
I agree with you. And I mean, I'm not religious, so I've always thought it's slightly ludicrous when people have said to me, I believe in this because I literally read it in the Bible. And I think, obviously religion, you should believe things if they're in the Bible, but you should also be able to have, if you believe something, you should also be able to develop the reasoning, as you were saying, Dejan, for
Yeah,
believing it, not just based because you read it, but because you can understand it in a logical sense. But I think the issue with absolute morality, though, is that in the world we have theocracies. We have
we
states
do.
like the
Yes.
Vatican, but also like Saudi Arabia. And I think finding a path through that is very, very difficult. Finding a path through those different morals is difficult. So perhaps to move on to the last question of our discussion today, we could look at political decisions. So
Yeah.
just as a caveat for anyone listening, me and Diane have discussed this earlier in the week. But Diane, do you think political decisions are made solely based on absolute morality or consequentialism, or a mixture of both?
Again.
Um,
Well, I think I want to first introduce this sort of caveat
oh, yeah.
of political decisions and moral decisions not being one and the same.
Yeah.
Because there are some decisions that people have made for purely political reasons with no care for the moral aspect of them. And yeah, again, two very sort of different sets of rules apply when talking about a moral decision. But if we're looking at moral decisions, I do think they come from an absolute point of view, because without looking at the moral absolute and looking at whether this is right or wrong, I don't think those changes would have happened. I think this will be a good debate because last time it got a bit heated. So
Yeah, I differ from you. I think there always can be a moral aspect in political decisions, even if it's pleasing your own morals or pleasing the morals that you try and promote.
fine.
But I think it's never obviously clearly moral. It differs. Sometimes political decisions, like a budget cut, that's obviously limited morality compared to like giving a new group the right to vote type thing.
Even I think, and we talked about slavery and
Yeah,
Abraham Lincoln, I think there's a strong argument to be made that that decision was a more political than a moral one,
yeah.
with Abraham Lincoln having less of a regard for sort of people's well-being than we think, and more regard for can I win this war.
Yeah, but I think for him that there's still always a moral aspect because for him that shows, I guess, a lack of morals in any sense.
Yeah,
But I think, I mean, the one we said is that I am in fairness a bit of a mixture. I've been thinking about it since. I would say there are clear political decisions that have been made of absolutism, but then I think there are also many political decisions, primarily ones involving things such as movements, violent movements, or protest movements, or revolutions that are consequentialist.
yeah,
So the sort of more relativist side of things. The one that just came up to me literally as we just spoke then, and we've both studied this in our GCSE history studies, is the civil rights movement.
yeah.
I don't think there was any absolutist morals necessarily in US society that African Americans should have the right to vote. Because I think if there were those morals, then that movement would not have needed to have taken place for it. But I think if you look at the extent of that movement, a major factor of granting African Americans the right to vote was because of the amount of disruption caused by the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And I think, why did, for example, if you look at Alabama, why did they give people there the right for transport companies to have non-segregated buses? I think those people in those bus companies were actually racist, even when they made that decision. They didn't want to do it.
Yes,
But they feared the consequences of allowing the
but is
protest
that a
to
moral
carry on.
decision? Is that a
Yeah, that's.
moral decision?
I think
I think that's an economical decision.
no. I think it's
Because
a
the
moral
bus
decision.
companies, after the Montgomery bus boycott, they were just having no people on the buses. They were losing money, and they said, you know what, we need this to stop, or else we're going to go out of business.
Yeah,
So we need to implement this new law.
I agree with you there. It's an economic decision, but morality has a key aspect in that because what is
Do you
the
think so? I don't think
yeah,
they care.
because they're projecting a morality there that if you look at the morals to which that bus company was previously run, it was based on discrimination. They're now supposedly publicly accepting a moral system which ends things such as discrimination, such as segregation.
I
I agree with you, it's economic, but I think morality always has a part to play. I think whether it's the primary concern or whether it's what it shows, but that
well,
decision, that the display of that decision to the public in America at the time would have been moral. It showed a change in morals based on this movement.
well, I don't
I
know.
think.
I think what we should do
Oh yeah,
is sort of only look at political decisions where the primary purpose was a moral one,
yeah. Okay.
because I think when you look at sort of what does this show, I think you're going down a sort of very dark alley in which some decisions say, okay, what do we want to project? But other decisions, I don't think people even consider the moral aspect and just look at the money. They were like, you know what, we are losing so much money. I don't care. I want to be able to feed my family. I don't care if this goes against everything I believe in, but I'm going to do it so I can feed my family.
But I think it's a fairly bold claim. I think the civil rights movement is an example. I don't think the civil rights movement was an economic was a result.
Well, no, but that part of the civil
I
rights
think I
movement
think that
was.
was a fun. I think most movements, any movement in history that I can think of, has had a is fundamentally based on morality. Whether it's at a local scale of local bus companies, because you say it's a dark scale of saying, well, what do they show? But morality is sort of about that. Morality is the sort of values you project to the public. The values, let's say, if the morals are based on the law, the values of political decisions, the morals of political decision project. I think there's a large case of sort of showcasing is linked to morality.
I
What's your
think,
take
yeah,
there?
I agree with you. I agree with you, but I do think when you look at sort of things on a microscopic scale, such as bus companies or, places where people have a genuine economic gain, I don't think you made that point. But I think let's look at sort of, I don't know, giving the right to vote, and the Civil Rights Act of 1963. And I think that is definitely from an absolute perspective. I think people got so horrified at KKK attacks, MLK getting, you know, uh, had bombings at his house, etc., etc., etc. And Lyndon B. Johnson just saw that as I think, as a final moment where you were like, no, I've had enough with this. We cannot keep going like this. The morals need to change. And I think that in his mind was a decision of, that wasn't a decision of, okay, what outcome am I going to get out of this? It's more a decision of, you know what, this is horrible. We cannot keep endorsing this. We need to change.
I'd oppose you there by saying simply that I don't think in 1965 African Americans would have been given the right to vote if it were not for the civil rights movement. I
Yeah,
think
I
the
agree
civil
with
rights
you.
movement, and yeah, exactly. And my primary argument for that is because the consequences of the civil rights movement and the consequences of ending that movement are the primary reason, and the consequences of the movement in general, highlighting, the movement highlighted the prejudice towards
But
African
but but
Americans.
that's not a
That
relativist
showed,
point.
I know, but let me carry on. That showed to
Yeah.
Lyndon B. Johnson the need to make this moral change. Lyndon B. Johnson, whether he believed it or not, that African Americans should be given the right to vote, I don't think he was concerned about absolute morality, because if he was, he'd have made that decision. himself before or without the movement, or JFK actually would have made the decision. But no, he made it based off the consequences of what he was seeing of the civil rights movement. What do you have to say, Dan?
I've got 2 points there. I think number one, I don't think the sort of general consensus on morality matters. One, I don't think that, you need to look at sort of American society as a whole. I think you need to look at the person making the decisions. One, I'll back that up later. And the second thing, I think, yeah, I agree with you. I think the consequence of the civil rights movement, which were highlighting the deep injustice African Americans face, was definitely a part of the decision. But I don't think that's a relativist point at all. I think that's a point of sort of, you have a problem. It's like, I don't know, you have water coming in your house because your roof is bad, right? You know? And the sort of builder doesn't want to come in because it's Sunday, But then you send him a picture of your room being halfway into water and you sort of a baby dying. Then the shock factor of that is like, it's not a relativist decision. Oh, I'm going to come in and fix this. It's more an absolutist decision of, hold on, this is a serious issue I did not know about to that extent.
Based off the consequences, though, of that picture.
But that doesn't matter.
Now they understand the consequences of what could happen if they don't come in. They're making the decision.
Yeah, but that's not a relativist
Yeah, but
point.
that's still no. But that's still. I'm arguing consequentialist. I said at the start. That's still consequentialist, though, because the consequences.
I wouldn't view it as that. I would view it as the
you said they saw the picture.
Yeah, I think
if he was
shock
absolutist,
factor of realizing.
Yeah, that consequence, the shock. Because if he was absolutist, he'd have come in straight away to fix that leaking tap.
No, but it isn't. It isn't though, because I see where you're going, but I think here we have another differing opinion in that I don't view the decision as consequentialist because of actions that have happened in the past. I think a consequentialist decision for me is I look at the future consequences of what I'm going to do, not the past, right? Because everything, if you look at the past, is a consequentialist decision. And then, you can't.
I don't entirely
do you know what I
understand.
mean?
Yeah. Yeah, no, carry on with your second point, though. Carry on with your second point.
And the idea is, I think you look at 1964 America, and the shock factor from the civil rights movement didn't necessarily, in my opinion, say, well, look, if you don't give us the right to vote, this can happen. It was more a thing of, I'm the president of the United States. I now know what's happening in the South. I am appalled by what's happening in the South, and I'm going to change that because that, my morality, the laws of morality tell me that's wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I still disagree with you there. I think on the consensus on morality, I think in a political body, political decision-making, consensus on morality is fairly necessary, primarily because everyone knows one person in a democratic society doesn't make all the decisions.
Well, no, but you can't have...
He's got to have moral support, I'm trying to say, from his own party to have made that decision. So I think a consensus on morality is needed. So I agree with your first point.
But that doesn't need to be 50 plus, 50% plus.
I mean, in your party it does, yeah. Because if not, if
in your party it does, but not in the larger society as a whole.
Yeah, I mean,
you can have people who don't have the support of the majority of the people and be in power.
But I think, even then, it's very difficult to make a huge moral decision without a consensus majority on it.
But I mean, it's been done. Abraham Lincoln with the slaves.
Yeah, it's been done, but you could say in the North, though, that was the sort of consensus there. The consensus of the North. It
wasn't in the South.
It wasn't in the South, but of the larger body in the North. Obviously, the North was more populated, but I
think you can look at the civil rights movement and make the same argument, that in the North, that was the consensus, and you had the Deep South be the main issue.
Yeah, but that would say there was a moral consensus, though, wouldn't there? If the North...
Well, not necessarily. It depends where you are.
Yeah, but I'm saying...
where you are. If you go in the South and you pick out 5 people at random...
Yeah, but the president had a moral consensus of... the president had a moral consensus.
Well, it depends where.
But across the country. Or
across the country, if you randomly pick someone, then fine.
Yeah. No, and in his decision-making within his party, there was a moral consensus. So I think moral consensus in the big picture is needed. I still think... I mean, from studying the civil rights movement, I do think this role of the civil rights movement was instrumental in the right to vote. And going on these consequences, as I previously said, if he was concerned about these so-called laws of morality, JFK would have made his landmark
But it
thing.
wasn't JFK anymore. Maybe
No, okay,
JFK was a racist.
I know, but no, but the civil rights movement obviously happened under JFK. So I think if it was purely concerned with morality, then JFK, who perhaps got the wheels rolling for the Civil Rights Act, if we say that, in 1963, he would have,
Yeah.
without the movement, before the movement, let's say in 1960, when he was president, he would have made his landmark decision, his landmark moral decision to change it. That would have been pre-civil rights movement, basically. But
What if JFK didn't care?
exactly, so he didn't have a big moral law, did he? Then Dan, he didn't have this
Well, maybe
absolute moral
Lyndon B.
law.
Johnson did.
If JFK didn't care, he did not have this absolute huge moral law.
No, but I think Lyndon B. Johnson did.
I don't think he did. I think Lyndon B. Johnson, I don't think there's any evidence to show what you're saying, firstly. I don't think history shows Lyndon B. Johnson was a particularly morally concerned figure, sort of casting my mind at the Vietnam War there. But I think...
Why do you think he did it then?
I think he did because of the consequences of the civil rights movement. He saw the economic effects. You mentioned them earlier. He saw the huge amount of societal disruption. He saw the consequences of this movement. And he said, yeah, it should change.
But I don't think that's a consequentialist decision, John. A
It is. It's based on
consequentialist decision. Well, no, a consequentialist decision is a decision where you look at the consequences of your actions. It's sort of like, you don't look what happened in the past. You're like, if I make this decision, what are the consequences?
This wasn't happening in the past. This was happening in the present. In the present, he saw the civil rights movement and he said, okay, which one will cause the better consequences? He made the decision of knowing the consequences of the civil rights movement continuing. And he said it would be better to change the law. If it was absolutist, it's very hard to make an absolutist judgment on this because obviously the movement was happening. So it's hard to know. But I don't think there's any evidence to sort of show either side in the debate.
Yeah, I don't think you can look at the evidence because you can't ask Lyndon B. Johnson what were you thinking.
Yeah, exactly. I think clearly the evidence would show that he was concerned with the consequences of the civil rights movement. Let's be honest, Lyndon B. Johnson is the man from the deep south of the USA. I'm fairly sure that he is. I'm fairly even sure that there were caveats in his early career surrounding the access to the right to vote. Primarily because, Dan, you can fact check me here, but was he governor of Texas?
I'm going to check.
He was involved in...
I do think he was, yes. I mean, he's Texan. So.
Yeah, so, I mean, he grew up in a place where African Americans did not have the right to vote. So I doubt he would have had a particular moral persuasion on the issue. If he had, he would have introduced legislation at an earlier period. But I think he saw...
He was a Texan senator and congressman.
Yeah. So I think in reality, he knew and understood the consequences of the civil rights movement. Knowing these consequences, he decided to make this landmark decision, purely based on knowing the economic effects of what would happen. On the global stage, the civil rights movement was extremely embarrassing for the USA. The civil rights movement was in many ways a global movement, whereas other countries' civil rights movements were not nearly as global as the USA's.
Yeah, well,
some of the opinion that he saw the consequence of this movement, then made the decision.
Yeah, I can see that point there. Again, I do think it's really difficult to either look at either side and say, was this purely a consequentialist decision, or was there genuine sort of awakening in realizing that, you know, African Americans not having the right to vote is abhorrent. You know, I don't think you can look at that in any way, either way, you know, and just say one cannot make the argument that, you know, the civil rights movement did highlight these sort of, I don't even know how to call them, but these sort of actions that were happening in the South, these lynchings, everything, and that genuinely sort of caused a change, and said, you know what, whoa, what on earth, you know? I don't think you can look at it, and my big point here is, I don't think without a genuine change in morality, people would have been as bothered to get it passed.
That's it. However, I think we'll perhaps leave it to you, the listeners, to decide, as we've got to go. But I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. Hope you've enjoyed the debate. In the words of one of our sponsors, the Free Speech Union, we encourage debate, we encourage freedom of speech. I think disagreement and debate is what we need more of in the world today. So if you're not sure, then debate it yourselves as well. Or comment us, like the podcast, subscribe, and leave a comment of what you think.
Perfect. Thank you. See you next week.
See you there.